like East High School, right? It's laid out on 11 acres because it was built, I don't know, 75 years ago. It doesn't need all 11 of those acres anymore. There's easily an acre in the back where if you said as a public entity, we would find a private developer and say, we will deed you 1 acre of this land at 10% of its cost. Which if 30% of your cost is real estate, that's dramatically cut the total cost of the project, which now means you could build 20, 30 units on that land, and you could have them on a 50-year lease where that rent is kept to a band of affordability for a long-term lease, which means now as a teacher, you're not worried that a year later someone's gonna buy the property and increase your rent by 50%. And the benefit of that is you have the capacity to actually make the 4% state credits that we have right now that aren't enough to close a deal, actually enough to be workable for developers. And so I think if we want to make long-term impact on a problem of this scale, you're going to have public-private partnerships that include assets that we have enough of to solve the problem and enough of in all 64 counties, because you're going to need to do this in Durango and in Alamosa and in Grand Junction as well as in Denver and Boulder. And so I have proposed that the next step ought to be making sure we can dramatically increase that stock so teachers and nurses and first job for folks getting their first jobs have a chance to get housing that's affordable, where they know they can make a commitment to stay in Colorado and stay for long term without every year or year and a half being worried that their rent's going to get doubled. So that's our proposal. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Mike. Victor Mitchell.
So the greatest thing we can do in Colorado to improve affordable housing is to improve earning power. In fact, actually, we've never have had as many regulations as we have today. And there was actually a commission study recently that people under 30 now in Colorado believe they can do better working in government than they can working in the private sector. Now, a decade ago, 13% of all Colorado businesses were early stage businesses that have been formed within the last 12 months. Today, it's 8%. So we've got to break that trend. There's nothing more. Now, large employers are different. Large employers' jobs are simply not as stable as they once were. The modern economy works very differently today than it even did a few years ago, where people are working 9 to 3 to get health benefits, but then they're moonlighting as a graphic artist, or they're flipping a home, or they're driving an Uber. We've got to create pathways where people will ultimately want to go out and start a small business. Last year I taught, or 2 years ago, I taught as an adjunct professor at CSU in the business college. And I can tell you I was shocked. Well, on one thing, I was very pleased to hear that most of my students wanted to someday start a small business. But very few of them actually wanted to work in corporate America. We're not creating a regulatory environment that's really conducive for people to go, especially our young people, to go out and create jobs. Now, I talked earlier about affordable housing. The #1 driver of affordable housing is the construction defect law. It needs to go away. It needs to be entirely repealed once and for all. It's a failed policy. We should own that. It didn't work as it was intended. It was sold to the people of Colorado. We have to streamline the whole way real estate development is done. As I said earlier, I think you should be able to pull your own permits by going to a qualified architect. But we have to also bridge, most importantly, the urban and rural divide in our state. I've been all around the state of Colorado. I've been to 59 of our 64 counties. We have supporters across all 64 counties. There is an enormous divide economically between rural Colorado and urban Colorado, where kids are literally leaving to go to school and they don't want to come back to their own communities because there's nothing there for them. So we have to figure out ways where people have more control over their financial future and less government dependency. And we've created such an environment between Medicaid and food stamps and many other government overreach that's really impacted people to provide for themselves and their families. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Cynthia Kaufman.
Well, I want to start by acknowledging something I think a couple of folks have mentioned, which is that affordable housing isn't just a problem that we have in Denver and in the Front Range. It is something that impacts folks all across the state, and I have seen it in my work as Attorney General with local communities as we have looked for housing options for women and not just women, but men too, who are victims of domestic violence and need to get out of their current housing situation very quickly. And we're talking about something beyond just a temporary place for folks to stay in a shelter, but where do they go so that they don't have to go back into a living situation that is oppressive, that is potentially life-threatening to them? And how can we create some independence for those folks. And I've looked at it with people across the state, and it seems to be an issue no matter what community you're in. But I'll take the mountain communities as an example. Just that folks there's so many good people working on issues of affordable housing, and yet they don't see an end in sight to the problem. And they say we have empty units sitting here that people only use a portion of the year, and we could use those for folks who need them. But how do we make that happen? So I think that there is great creativity and innovation and possibility here in terms of how we use what we have. I also think we can look at higher density housing, certainly, and lower impact fees. I think one of the issues that we have to deal with, particularly in the Front Range, is that we have to look for ways to make construction of new housing more affordable. And this is kind of back to the basics as far as I'm concerned. But we have a mountain of regulations, some of which don't really, I don't think, accomplish what they were intended to, and should be explored for some sort of repeal. Our fees need to be set by a reasonable methodology. That should be re-examined. And our permitting processes are outrageously long in some communities. And if we could just stop or shorten the delays and the time it takes to get a permit, to do your environmental study, to build a home, we would address many of the issues that I think that we have. We have so much to offer in Colorado and in our communities, and I don't want the message that we send to the rest of the country to be, it's not affordable to live in Colorado anymore. I don't think that is what we want. I think we want people to share our Colorado experience, and we want people to buy and sell houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Donna Lynn.
Well, thank you. I've been called a pro-business Democrat, as if that's a bad thing, and I'm really proud of the fact that I'm a pro-business Democrat, having been in business and I think being sensitive to the issues. I was the chair of the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce and on the board for 9 years. We grappled with a lot of these problems, and I think it's important to understand the governor does not have the authority over local communities. So while we can talk about repealing regulations or modifying regulations, they are predominantly at the local level. And I think it requires some hard work with somebody who's collaborative to work with communities, to talk about the impact that what they're doing is having on economic development overall in the state and the reputation of the state, quite frankly. Imagine we're the state that we were the first state to allow recreational marijuana, but we're going to now tighten down on housing regulations. We're definitely bipolar in some respects. I've already mentioned that I think creating a housing department, that doesn't mean new jobs. We do have some great people that work on housing in the state. It just doesn't have a seat at the table, and I think that's critical. We have, in the last year, I worked on how we could repurpose some of our marijuana tax revenues to actually move some of it into supportive housing and affordable housing. I think that's something that we should continue to talk about with our legislature. It was a relatively easy fix because I think there was a recognition. It was a small down payment on some of the housing needs that we have, but nevertheless, it was close to 17 million that we moved into housing. We have lower income tax housing credits, as many of you are aware of, and I think having a conversation about how we actually increase those lower income tax housing credits to provide the incentive for developers to be able to do more affordable housing is going to be important. I think we can't talk about housing without talking about transportation. I don't know if we're going to have time to get to that question, but we've got to match our transportation systems, and particularly when we're talking about some of the mass transit that we have built, and still thinking, well, it's okay to drive somewhere. We need to really think about great development around some of our transit locations. That's the way most major cities have built their transit systems. I would actually, even though I am a pro-business Democrat, I found it surprising. I agreed with Victor on something, and that is having a workforce that actually supports the housing industry. These are great paying jobs. They can help us in rural as well as urban communities, and how we continue to build a pipeline of workers who work in building housing is going to be important. So I have a lot of big ideas around how, big and little, that we can do, take on some of this work. I am concerned about public lands. The state of Colorado, by the way, is one of the biggest landlords in the state. We have plenty of opportunities to sell off some of our land without having an impact on public lands.
Donna, just a few more seconds, and we've got plenty of time.
Great.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. And I think that's actually the last point, that the state can play an active role in being a dispenser of some of the lands that we have, and work collaboratively on the kind of development that we would like to see around some of those properties. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Noel Ginsberg, and we're running great on time, so you got 3 minutes. Don't worry.
You know what's really fun about going last is there's a lot of good ideas. And one of the things I've learned over my lifetime in business is that take the best ideas, integrate them into an overall solution, and move forward. So there are some things that I agree with and disagree with that you've heard. I do believe that the construction defects law that was put in place years ago has been incredibly damaging to our state. I also believe that the work that took place last year has fixed the components that shut down construction of condominiums and apartments that people can own. If it hasn't, as governor, I will work to make the final fix. I don't think deregulating everything makes sense. We do need to protect the safety and quality of the housing that is being built in this state. But I think we're there. I hope we're there. Now, the second piece that I'd add is I sat on the State Economic Development Commission for 2.5 years. And within those funds, we have been allocating millions of dollars, legislative